I have the honor of working on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples, and I'm a visitor on the traditional territories of the Kwatsan First Nations. I acknowledge their welcome and graciousness as I live, learn, and seek knowledge here. Hello and Haichkwa. My name is Patricia, and I'm going to discuss what most involved in the various salmon industries in British Columbia would describe as a salmon crisis. Pictured here are some salmon in the spawning process. I will not be discussing the life cycle of salmon here today, other than to say the salmon process is a path filled with immense struggle. It takes great strength for the salmon to make their way upstream and over many obstacles in order to lay their eggs in the spawning grounds so new life can be born. It is the end of the salmon's life, as you see pictured here, but it is also the beginning of new life for new salmon. I use these visuals as I hope they are reflective of some of the restoration and reconciliation efforts currently underway in Canada regarding Indigenous peoples and their fight for autonomy and self-determination, particularly in regard to the saving of our salmon. The article upon which this study is based is pictured here to the right. The photograph is showing the many sport fishing boats at the mouth of what is now known as the Fraser River. Long before contact, First Nations peoples used to use the Fraser River as a transportation route and a source of food. I will discuss the critically low numbers of returning salmon spawning, which is taking a dramatic toll on the number of salmon available to First Nations and their constitutionally protected fishing rights. Within this article and several others on this topic, First Nations peoples are calling for an outright ban on sport and commercial fishing in an effort to sustain and renew salmon stocks. Some have gone as far as to make a request that the salmon crisis be declared a disaster. Not only does the lack of salmon negatively affect First Nations food supply and traditional practices, but it also has far-reaching effects in the over 100 other species of fish and wildlife that rely on salmon for survival, such as the orcas, the eagles, and the bear. In short, salmon are an integral part of a delicate ecosystem. As you can see in the photo, there are hundreds of sport fishing boats on the waters, some with several fishing lines out in hopes of catching their limit for the day. Limits set by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans we will be discussing in a moment. So for some history, salmon has been long established and acknowledged as a pre-contact and integral part of Indigenous culture and traditions, existing, as we will learn when we discuss the sparrow case. Salmon were treated with great respect, and many rituals of cultural significance and ceremonies were conducted around and with the salmon, such that the salmon are not only nutritional food, but also feeds the spirits of First Nations peoples. During potlatch in pre-contact times, the harvesting of salmon was carefully monitored to ensure their sustainability. Decisions were made with a deep knowledge of timing, location, methods, and quantity of fishing harvests by community elders. Salmon and fishing was a cultural law within the coastal Indigenous communities, as indicated. Indeed, the salmon is a cultural symbol represented in First Nations art and carvings as a symbol of life, abundance, prosperity, and nourishment, as it sustains life in humans, animals, and the environment. All of this is in peril due to the decline in salmon numbers. Upon the arrival of the first settlers, the First Nations peoples were happy to share the resources of the land, including the salmon. It was not long before settlers stripped the First Nations of this resource, and the effects of colonization began marginalizing and isolating First Nations peoples. Assimilation efforts by settlers were well underway. The federal government eventually formed the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and First Nations people could no longer fish without licenses. The legal issues we will look at are how the federal government regulates both Indigenous peoples under the Indian Act and Fisheries and Oceans under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I'll call that DFO from now on. Indigenous fishing rights are protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. Section 35 rights have been challenged and confirmed before the courts in the 1990 Supreme Court of Canada decision in R versus Sparrow. This important decision held that Aboriginal fishing rights are protected under the Constitution of Canada under Section 35 and cannot be infringed without justification based on the Canadian government's fiduciary duty to Aboriginal peoples of Canada. As a result of this case, the Sparrow test was implemented. Unfortunately, the decision in Sparrow and the resulting Sparrow test focuses on infringement of rights and the justification of the infringement rather than the fishing rights themselves. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, was adopted by the General Assembly. While Section 35 is legislated and entrenched in Canadian law, UNDRIP is an international law which is quasi-legal in nature and not yet binding, other than as an interpretive tool for the courts. In 2010, the Canadian government endorsed UNDRIP, and as of February 2019, the BC government has stated its commitment to be the first province to introduce legislation to implement UNDRIP. How does this affect the salmon crisis? UNDRIP provides for the recognizing of basic human rights for Indigenous peoples and their rights to self-determination, as well as setting standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples. As we have learned in the previous slides regarding the history and significance of salmon in First Nations cultures and lives, decisions regarding fisheries and oceans would then include Indigenous legal principles as an equal voice. Most court cases have been focused on Indigenous peoples having to prove their use and occupation of lands. Once UNDRIP is implemented as legislation, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples would then coexist as self-determining and sovereign entities with overlapping jurisdiction to lands and waters. UNDRIP states that Indigenous peoples have the rights to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired, which was a quote. This goes well beyond the Section 35 rights enshrined in the Constitution and provides an opportunity to discuss fishing rights where the word existing is not at issue as it was in the case of Sparrow. As of June 2019, Canada has modernized the Fisheries Act to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples and include Indigenous knowledge in decisions. In addition, DFO's website states they are committed to recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights pursuant to Section 35 and UNDRIP. This is a step in the right direction, but from a sustainable perspective and for the sake of saving a species at risk, our salmon, UNDRIP will need to be fully implemented as legislation so that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples have equal and overlapping jurisdiction. Would the implementation of UNDRIP improve the current salmon crisis? My opinion is that with a legal or an equal voice in the management of this valuable resource, yes. December 2015 brought the completion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada report. Well, as complete as could be for a document that provides for 94 calls to action. But Canada is now equipped with a roadmap to revitalize the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and Canadian society, according to the website. After 100 years of colonization. If we refer back to the subject article, we will see that First Nation peoples are calling for DFO to impose a restriction or outright ban on sport and commercial fishing. To date, this has not yet come to fruition. We remain ever hopeful that with the implementation of UNDRIP and other reconciliation efforts, Indigenous peoples will gain autonomy and self-direction and be able to have a meaningful, balanced, and equal input into decisions made regarding the management of salmon, fisheries, and oceans, and other resources for their communities. Haichkwa, and thank you for listening to my presentation.